Life is a business that does not cover its costs, Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788–1860, famously declared, encapsulating his view of existence and threading through his remarkable life. In his early years, born into a wealthy merchant family, his father's death and rift with his mother shaped a sensitive, solitary nature. During his education, inspired by Kant and Plato at Göttingen and Berlin universities, he completed on the fourfold route of the principle of sufficient reason, laying his philosophical groundwork. His major achievement, The World as Will and Representation, posits will as the world's essence, views life pessimistically, and extols art and asceticism as escapes. In personal life, he lived reclusively in Frankfurt with his dog, fiery-tempered, once pushing a neighbor downstairs, yet once wooed an Italian actress. Amid his historical context, clashing with Hegel's era, he was overlooked until late recognition. His later years ended quietly, his ideas influencing Nietzsche, Freud, and artists, resonating today. Overall, he confronted suffering, blended Eastern and Western thought, and, despite flaws, left a sincere legacy. His solitary life and profound philosophy shine as a companion to truth in history. 1. Early life and background. Arthur Schopenhauer was born on February 22, 1788, in Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, a thriving port city then under Prussian control. His family background set the stage for his life and Xiang. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was a successful merchant, a stern man who valued freedom and Enlightenment ideals, hoping his son would follow in his commercial footsteps. His mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, was a literary soul who later became a moderately famous German writer, thriving in social circles and hosting salons. Schopenhauer's early years were marked by upheaval. In 1793, when Danzig was annexed by Prussia, threatening the family business, his father moved him to Hamburg. This instability left an impression on young Arthur. His father was strict, often taking him on trips across Europe to broaden his horizons, teaching him English, French, and Italian, skills that later fueled his philosophical pursuits. But that rigidity weighed on him. He once wrote, "My father's will was the first chain on my childhood." Then, in 1805, tragedy struck. His father fell to his death from their Hamburg home, officially an accident, though many suspect suicide. Schopenhauer, just 17, called it, "the greatest misfortune of my life," sensing fate's unpredictability. His father's estate gave him financial freedom, freeing him from the need to earn a living and letting him chase his intellectual passions. After this, his mother took him and his sister Adele to Weimar, diving into a lively social scene with figures like Goethe. But Johanna's flamboyance clashed with Arthur's seriousness. Their relationship soured, and by 1814, they parted ways for good after a bitter falling out. He wrote to her, "You chose the noise of salons, I chose the solitude of thought." This break deepened his distrust of human bonds, setting the tone for his isolated life and pessimistic philosophy. 2. Education and intellectual awakening. Schopenhauer's education was where his philosophical mind took root. After his father's death in 1807, he briefly followed the plan to train as a merchant in Hamburg, but he hated it, calling it a cage for the soul. By 1809, at 21, he broke free and enrolled at the University of Göttingen, starting with medicine before switching to philosophy. His mentor, Karl Reinhold, introduced him to Kant and Plato, two giants who shaped his thinking. At Göttingen, he devoured Kant's critique of pure reason, captivated by the split between phenomena and the unknowable, thing in itself. Yet he found Kant's limits on knowledge too timid. Plato's theory of forms sparked his love for metaphysics. As he later noted, "Plato was my first philosophical light." In 1811, he transferred to the University of Berlin, attending lectures by Fichte and Schleiermacher. But he scoffed at Fichte's idealism, dismissing it as empty bluster, and grew frustrated with the sunny optimism dominating German philosophy. In 1813, at 25, he finished his doctoral dissertation on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, earning his degree from the University of Jena. This work, analyzing causality in four forms, physical, logical, mathematical, and motivational, became the seed of his later representation theory. He wrote, "All knowledge rests on the principle of sufficient reason, but this is just the frame of representation, not its essence." Though it went unnoticed at the time, it showed his sharp logic and critical take on Kant. After graduating, he retreated to Dresden, where he began crafting the world as will and representation. Here, he also discovered Eastern philosophy, Upanishads and Buddhist texts. Writing, "The wisdom of the Vedas showed me the illusion of will. Buddhism's compassion pointed to liberation." He also soaked up Rousseau, Shakespeare, and Goethe, honing a literary style that made his philosophy vivid and accessible. This phase turned him from a student into a thinker, blending Western rigor with Eastern insight, paving the way for his unique pessimistic vision. 3. Major philosophical achievements and works. When it comes to Schopenhauer's philosophical achievements, we have to talk about the world as will and representation. He wrote it at 31, publishing it in 1819, and later beefed it up with an expanded edition in 1844. This book is the crown jewel of his thought, his biggest gift to the world. So, what's it about? Schopenhauer says the world has two sides. One's representation, everything we see, hear, and think about, like trees or traffic, all filtered through our minds, kind of like Kant's phenomena. The other's will, the real deal, a blind, irrational force driving humans, animals, even plants. Think of it like when you're hungry and can't stop wanting food, that's the will pushing you. He's pretty grim about life, saying this will makes us miserable. Can't get what you want? You're in pain. Get it? You're bored. He put it memorably, life swings between pain and boredom like a pendulum. Sounds heavy, right? But he offers two ways out. Art, especially music, which he says lets you forget your troubles for a bit. He thought music was special. It doesn't copy the world but echoes the will itself. The other way's tougher. Give up the will entirely, live like a monk, free of desires, inspired by Buddhism. The book flopped at first. Schopenhauer was furious, saying, "These fools don't get it, my work's for the future." And he was right. Later, Nietzsche, Freud, and others dug into it. He also took a swing at Kant, arguing Kant overplayed reason and missed the will's power. Schopenhauer pulled philosophy off its rational pedestal and dunked it into the messy reality of human nature, a move still rippling through thought today. 4. Personal life and character. Now, let's talk about Schopenhauer's personal life and character. This man was one of a kind. He never married, had hardly any friends, and spent his later years with just a dog for company, living like a lone wolf. Get to know him, and his sharp edges might catch you off guard, but his quirks make for some great stories. In 1831, a cholera outbreak drove him from Berlin to Frankfurt, where he settled into a quiet, solitary routine, writing in the morning, walking by the main river at noon, reading at night. His home was empty, no wife, no kids, just books and a poodle named Atman, meaning world soul. He adored that dog, once saying, "Without dogs, I'd lose my mind dealing with human nonsense." One time, while walking, Atman ran off, and he frantically called its name up and down the streets. Passersby couldn't believe how worked up he got over a pet. His temper was legendary, and his tongue could cut like a knife. Take this story. In 1821, in Berlin, he got into a spat with a seamstress who kept making noise outside his door. In a fit, he pushed her down the stairs, injuring her. The court made him pay compensation for years. Another time, staying at an inn, he banged on a neighbor's door over some racket, nearly starting a fight. He had strong views on women, too, writing in on women that they're between men and children. It's a sore spot today, but he wasn't always so sour. Records say he once courted an Italian actress with flowers, only to get rejected and grumble, "Women have no taste." He loathed Hegel, calling him a charlatan, and even scheduled lectures against him at Berlin University, only to see students flock to Hegel instead, leaving him fuming. Behind the prickly front, though, he was deeply sensitive, maybe too lonely to let anyone close. 5. Historical context and contemporary reception. Schopenhauer lived in the early 19th century, a golden age for German philosophy, but he didn't have it easy. Back then, Hegel was the star, preaching that history was reason marching forward, and everyone bought into the optimism. Fichte and Schelling were busy hyping up the power of the mind, too. Then Schopenhauer steps in and says, "Hold on, life's just a pit of suffering." You can imagine how well that went over. In 1819, he dropped the world as will and representation, hoping to take on Hegel. He even set up lectures in Berlin to compete, but students ignored him for Hegel's packed halls, and he quit in a huff. He'd rant, "That man's nonsense has fooled the whole age." Truth is, he was a bit out of step with his time. Germany had just come through the Napoleonic Wars, and people were fired up about rebuilding and national pride. Who wanted to hear, "Life's meaningless"? His book sold so poorly that most copies ended up as scrap paper. He'd sigh, "My philosophy's not for these people, it's for later generations." He wasn't wrong. By the 1850s, Hegel's shine had faded, and Schopenhauer's dark take started finding fans. Wagner praised him, saying, "He's right, life is bitter." Writers began nodding along, too. Late in life, he smiled, "My time's finally here. Too bad he couldn't bask in it longer." 6. Later years and posthumous influence. Schopenhauer spent his later years in Frankfurt, living quietly and a little lonely. He stuck close to his poodle, Atman, following the same old routine, writing in the morning, strolling at noon, reading at night. His health slipped, lung troubles kept flaring up, but his mind stayed sharp. On September 21, 1860, he passed away at home, 72 years old, without much fanfare. No family, no heirs, he left his money to charity, matching his philosophy of compassion for suffering. After he was gone, his fame took off, a classic case of posthumous glory. Nietzsche was a huge fan early on, calling him a true educator, though he later broke away with his will to power. Freud and his crowd picked up ideas like the unconscious, echoing Schopenhauer's will. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus ran with his take on life's absurdity. In the arts, Wagner leaned hard on him, weaving his tragic vibe into Tristan und Isolde. Writers like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Kafka sprinkled his bitterness into their stories. Today, his thoughts still hit home. Modern life's full of stuff, but empty inside, and his pessimism makes you think. He cared about animals, too, opposing cruelty, which lines up with today's green ideas. 7. Overall assessment and modern relevance. Looking at Schopenhauer's life, he was a one-of-a-kind philosopher. He spent his days wrestling with how tough life is, but he didn't just complain, he pointed to music as a break and asceticism as a way out. His work might feel heavy, but you've got to give it to him. He spoke the truth as he saw it, no sugarcoating. His big win was the will philosophy, yanking us off the throne of reason and saying, we're all driven by desire. He mixed in Eastern stuff, Buddhism, Hinduism, way ahead of his time. And his take on music as metaphysics in sound blew minds, inspiring Wagner and others. He wasn't perfect, though. That pessimism could drag you down, making it hard to enjoy anything. He barely touched on society or history, just zeroing in on personal woes. And his views on women? A real misstep, tough to defend today. Still, he's got something for us now. Life's overflowing with things, yet we're lost, and his ideas are like a mirror, asking what we're chasing. His less is more vibe fits with minimalism, and his kindness to animals echoes environmentalism. He said, truth is a solitary companion. He lived that solitude, but his thoughts keep us company, making you wonder about life's worth.